The first thing I understood was the smell of wet ash. The second was that I had a body, and it was starving. I lay on a pallet of rotten straw, staring at a ceiling made of cracked beams and patched thatch, and for a long moment I genuinely believed I had died and gone somewhere unfinished, a waiting room God had forgotten to furnish. Then my stomach clenched so hard I groaned out loud, and the groan came out wrong, thin, cracked, a boy's voice instead of my own. That was when I remembered the truck, the rain on the windshield, the headlights that weren't supposed to be in my lane. That was when I understood I wasn't going back. It took me the better part of a day to piece together where and who I now was. The boy whose skin I wore had a name, Lin Shu, 15 winters old, and a story that ended 3 nights ago when a fever took both his parents inside of 6 hours and left him too hollowed out by grief to do anything but lie down and wait to follow them. He very nearly had. I could still feel the ghost of that decision in his bones, a kind of inherited exhaustion that made even blinking feel like a chore. He also had a sister. She found me awake on the second evening, and the sound she made when she saw my eyes open was not a child sound at all. It came from somewhere older, somewhere that had spent 2 days rehearsing how to be alone. She was small, maybe 6, with hair the dull yellow-brown of malnutrition and a steamed bun clutched in both hands like it was the last solid thing in the world. "Brother's awake," she whispered, like she didn't trust the sentence yet. Then, louder, fiercer, "I told Granny Tao you weren't going to die." I told her. Her name was Rue. I learned that from her, not from the boy's borrowed memories, because some things you only really learn by watching someone say them to your face like they matter. She broke the bun in half before I could stop her and pushed the bigger piece at my chest. And when I tried to give it back, she clamped her small hands around mine like she was sealing a vault. I watched her throat work as she swallowed her half too fast, the way hungry children do, like the food might be taken back if they're slow about it. Something in my chest. Lin Shu's chest, my chest now, I supposed, twisted hard enough that I had to look away from her for a second. We ate in silence. It was, without exaggeration, the best meal of either of my lives. It was the cracked bowl that told me something else had come through the crash with me. I was turning it over in my hands afterward, thinking about nothing in particular, when a thin gold outline traced itself around the bowl's rim, visible only to me, hanging in the air like a held breath. And underneath it, words assembled themselves out of nothing. Chipped clay bowl. Worn. Unremarkable. 1 line. Plain text. No border but the faint gold ring around the object itself. I nearly dropped it. In my old life, 3 decades of it, I had been an appraiser. The kind people brought broken inheritances to, hoping for a windfall and usually getting a polite explanation of why their grandmother's vase was worth $40 and a hug. I had spent my whole career learning to see things, hairline cracks, regilding, the wrong patina on a fake. I had never once, not in 30 years, had an object simply tell me what it was. I tested it on the rice jar. Empty clay jar, no value. I tested it on the firewood. Pine, slightly damp. Plain text every time. That same faint gold thread outlining whatever I looked at, like the world itself had decided to start including price tags. Then I tested it on a weed growing through a crack in the courtyard stones, a low straggling thing with small 5-petaled flowers the color of a bruise, and the outline around it flared brighter, a deeper gold, threaded with something like a pulse, and 2 lines came up instead of 1. Bone knit vetch. Common grade medicinal herb. Men's hairline fractures and bruised tissue when boiled. I sat with that a long time, turning the dry little plant in my fingers. A single line meant ordinary. A flare, and a second line meant the world had decided this particular thing was worth paying attention to. I didn't know yet what determined the difference, only that it existed, and that I, or whatever fragment of the universe had stapled itself to the inside of my skull during the crash, could read it. When I pointed it at Rue, mostly as a joke to lighten something in my own chest, the gold outline traced her small shape, and the first line made me snort despite myself. Human child, female, age 6. The second line did not make me laugh. Malnourished, long-term. Recovery possible with consistent food. I looked at her dry hair, her wrists like dropped twigs, and put the system away for the rest of the night. Some things didn't need confirming. They needed fixing. There was no food in the house. Not a grain. The land out back, what little of it the funeral hadn't already eaten, had gone to weeds 2 seasons running, and even if I planted today, today's hunger would still be tomorrow's hunger and the one after that. So I went looking for what I actually knew how to do. In my old life, I had kept a 16-foot bass boat I could never really afford and used every weekend I could steal, rain or not, mostly to get away from people who wanted things from me. It was the one skill of mine that had never once been about appraising anything's worth. I just liked the water. I found an old needle, bent it into a hook over a chopstick, twisted 3 lengths of rough hemp cord into something that might hold, and cut a long whip of bamboo from the dead grove behind the house. Rue watched the whole process with the rapt suspicion of a child who has decided something is either magic or nonsense and hasn't picked yet. "That's not a fishing pole," she informed me. "Fishing poles are bigger. This one's for clever fish," I told her. "The big poles scare them." She seemed to accept this completely, which I took as an early and troubling sign of how much she trusted me already. We dug worms from the cool dirt behind the wall and walked to the creek that cut along the village's eastern edge, gathering a small parade of curious children somewhere along the way kids do when something interesting is clearly about to happen and they have nowhere better to be. An old woman, Aunt Bay, I'd learn, stopped us in the lane and looked at me like I'd risen from a coffin, which, in a manner of speaking, I had. "3 days ago, the whole village had you in the ground," she said, not unkindly. "Now you're going fishing." "The dead don't get hungry," I said. "I do." She laughed, despite herself, and let us pass, though not before extracting a solemn promise that I wouldn't go near deep water. An oath she made me repeat twice with my hand flat on my chest, like it was a contract notarized by the village itself. At the creek, I walked the bank slowly before I ever wet a line, scanning the water the way I used to scan a customer's attic. Patient, methodical, looking for the thing underneath the obvious thing. Old habits. The gold outline flickered to life on a calm bend where the current slowed behind a fallen log, and the line of text confirmed what 20 years of weekends had already told me. Common feeding pocket. Small fish gather here. I found a second spot further down. Water curling under an overhanging mulberry tree thick with dropped fruit. And there the outline didn't just flicker. It bloomed, a deep, restless gold that pulsed slightly, like the system itself was excited. Notable feeding ground. Fruit drop attracts larger predatory fish. Outcome, favorable. I filed that one away for later. One hook, one chance to lose it. The smart play was small fish first. The first cast took less than a minute. The float twitched, dipped, and I set the hook on instinct 30 years deep, and a fat silver fish came arcing out of the water hard enough that the children on the bank actually screamed. Rue shrieked that I'd caught a dragon and nearly fell in trying to get a better look, which earned her a stern grab by the collar from the oldest boy in the group, a serious child named Datu, who had apparently appointed himself her personal safety officer without being asked. After that, it was just rhythm. Cast, wait, feel the tug arrive like a familiar handshake, pull. The system confirmed each fish edible in one flat plain text line, and I stopped checking after the fourth one. Some things you trust your hands to know. We walked home with a bucket heavy enough to ache my arms, half the village's children trailing behind us in a state of barely contained chaos, and by the time we reached the lane, half the adults had come out of their houses to see what the noise was about. I gave fish to everyone who'd helped carry the bucket. I gave more to Aunt Bay, who had worried over us like an aunt and deserved the dividend. When I asked, plainly and without shame, whether anyone could spare rice and oil until I found steadier footing, a broad-shouldered man named Uncle Han laughed and said neighbors weren't owed anything for being neighbors, and within 10 minutes, our empty kitchen had a half sack of rice, a jar of oil, a twist of salt, and more goodwill than I knew what to do with. That night, with rice steaming and fish hissing on a flat stone heated over the coals, there was no pan. The boys' parents had sold the last iron one to pay for their own funeral, which was a thought I did not let myself sit with for long. Rue ate like the meal might be rescinded at any moment and told me, very seriously, that it was better than anything Mother used to make. It was badly seasoned and undercooked in one corner. I knew exactly why she said it anyway, and it did not make me feel proud. It made me angry at a world that could do this to a 6-year-old and call it nothing unusual. I decided, somewhere between her first bowl and her second, that nothing unusual was no longer an acceptable description of our life. He came to me before I worked up the nerve to go to him. I woke the next morning to a stranger's fingers pressed against my wrist and went very still, very fast. Old reflexes, crash-related, before I recognized the face hovering over me. Healer Win. Village elders called him that the way you'd call someone Mr. out of habit rather than respect, I'd half expected, from the boy's borrowed memory of him, a tired old country doctor with herb-stained hands and not much else. The gold outline that bloomed around him when I let my gaze settle was not gold at all. It was a deep, banked crimson, like coals that hadn't quite gone out, and I had not seen that color on anything yet. Not the bowl, not the herb, not even the prize-feeding ground under the mulberry tree. The text beneath it took a full second longer to resolve, as though the system itself were being careful. Wen Jua, healer, cultivator, marrow tempering, third stage. Decades of accumulated practice, cultivator. I lay very still and let him finish checking my pulse while my mind rearranged an entire understanding of the world around that single word. This was not simply a hard, plain, low-technology past. There was something underneath it, something with stages, with accumulation, with a scale I didn't yet have the vocabulary for. Healer Wen walked alone into mountains that hunters twice his size wouldn't enter. Now I understood, in the space of one heartbeat, exactly why none of those mountains had ever managed to kill him. He pronounced me fully recovered, just thin and tired, and waved off my attempt at a deep bow with the easy irritation of someone who has had this exact argument many times before. When I told him, honestly, that I had nothing to pay him with, he said my recovery had been strange enough to interest him professionally, and that watching me heal would be payment of a sort all its own, which I suspected, even then, was a kindness dressed up as a transaction, so that I could accept it without shame. I gave him fish before he left. He took it without comment. The way a man takes something he understands costs more than it looks like it did. After he and Uncle Jang had gone, I sat alone in the doorway for a long time, turning the word cultivator over and over in my chest like a stone I couldn't decide whether to swallow or throw. I had spent 30 years learning to see the true worth hiding inside ordinary things. I had a sister with hair the wrong color and a stomach that hadn't been full in months. I had one hook, one line, and a gift I didn't fully understand yet, in a world that apparently ran on rules no appraiser back home had ever written a book about. Somewhere up that mountain, an old man who glowed like banked coals was about to teach me, without either of us quite meaning to, exactly how small ordinary was about to stop being. 3 days later, true to his word, Healer Wen sent Datu down the hill with a message. Come at noon. Bring the girl. Don't eat first. I left Rue playing with a knotted rag doll on the doctor's courtyard step, charmed half to sleep by the smell of mountain yam cake baking somewhere inside, and let the old man press me flat on a wooden table with my shirt off and 18 silver needles waiting in their case like a row of patient teeth. You flinched less than most men your age, he said, threading the first needle in below my collarbone. Most boys your size scream like I'm gutting a fish. I've had worse, I said, which was true in ways he couldn't possibly guess. He gave a short laugh and didn't ask. I liked that about him. There was a version of Healer Wen, I suspected, who had learned a long time ago not to go digging in places people didn't offer freely. When the last needle settled, he didn't withdraw his fingers the way he had the first time. He held it, turned it a slow quarter rotation, and a warmth bloomed outward from the point of contact. Not painful, not even unpleasant, just present. The way a held hand is present. I let my eyes drift half shut, and out of old habit, let the gold thread of my sight settle on him. The crimson outline I remembered from before had grown a fraction wider. The text beneath it had changed too, not by much, but enough that I noticed. Wen Zhuo, healer, cultivator, marrow tempering, third stage, advancing, advancing. I filed that away with the same care I'd filed the mulberry tree fishing hole. A thing worth understanding later, when I had more pieces of the puzzle to set around it. You're doing something to me, I said, not quite a question. Guiding your chi to settle where it should already be settling, he said, unbothered by being caught. Your meridians took damage when your body nearly died. I'm not putting anything in you that isn't already yours. Think of it as straightening a fence after a storm, not building a new one. And the part where it puts me to sleep, that part, he said, is just me being efficient with my afternoons. A patient who's awake asks too many questions. I was asleep within the minute anyway, which felt like proof of his point rather than an argument against it. I woke to find I had not, in fact, missed the only interesting part of the lesson. Healer Wen had moved out to the courtyard to run through his morning forms again. He did this twice some days, he told me later, when his chi felt restless, and through the half-open door I watched him for the second time, the same slow, water-smooth movements I'd glimpsed on our first visit. This time, I was ready for it. The instant the gold thread of my sight caught his motion, words assembled themselves with a speed that told me the system had been waiting for this exact moment. Cultivation technique detected. Flowing hollow form. Foundational stance set. Mimicry available. Begin simulation. YN. Yes, I thought, hard enough that it might as well have been shouted. A bar of pale light filled in across the bottom of my vision, climbing in small percentages with each completed movement. 15, 22, 30. And I held myself rigid in the doorway, barely breathing, terrified that blinking wrong might cost me the progress. He finished his set at 68%. The bar froze there, glowing faintly, patient, like it understood I'd be back. I felt the same flush of guilt I had the first time. He was teaching me herbs out of kindness and feeding my sister mountain cake out of something gentler than kindness. And here I was, quietly harvesting his life's work behind his back like a pickpocket at a wedding. I'd made myself a rule after the first time. Not unless he offers it himself, and I was breaking it again in real time, one stolen percentage point at a time. I told myself I'd ask him properly, someday, when I understood enough about this world to know what I'd even be asking for. It wasn't a good excuse. It was the only one I had. The herb sorting that followed was, against every expectation, the part of the day I looked forward to most. Healer Wen had drying racks under the eaves loaded with things I'd never have known the names of without my ability whispering them to me. Bone knit vetch, widow's lantern root, a curling silver-edged moss he called frost ear that the gold thread told me was used for fevers that wouldn't break by ordinary means. He'd name a plant, test whether I already knew it, correct me when I got the drying time wrong, and seemed genuinely pleased on the rare occasions I surprised him with something my system had already quietly confirmed. "You learn fast for a boy who claims he can barely read," he said, not looking up from the rack he was turning. "My grandfather taught me more than people give him credit for," I said, which was the original Lin Shu's truth wearing my mouth and felt only a little strange to say. Rue wandered over halfway through, sticky-fingered from cake, and announced without preamble that she had decided to become a doctor too, so she could fix people like Healer Wen had fixed me. The old man laughed so hard he had to set down the bundle of root he was holding, and told her that doctors needed steady hands and a strong stomach for ugly things, and asked if she thought she had both. She held up her hands, perfectly steady, and informed him with total confidence that she had never once been scared of anything in her whole life. I did not correct her. Some lies are worth letting a 6-year-old believe about herself for as long as the world allows it. We were nearly home, the long shadows of late afternoon stretching gold down the lane, when the dogs started barking. All of them, all at once, in the particular pitch dogs reserved for things that aren't squirrels. People came out of their doorways the way they had the day I went fishing, except this time nobody was smiling. A horse stood at the head of the lane, dust-caked and lathered like it had been ridden hard for most of a day, and the man dismounting from it did not belong to this village at all. He wore gray robes too clean for travel, a sword too well kept for decoration, and he moved the way Healer Wen moved. That same unhurried, water-smooth economy of motion that told a body it was wasting no energy whatsoever. Uncle Hans stepped forward to greet him with the careful, deferential voice village men use on tax collectors, and worse, and the stranger barely glanced at him before his eyes began moving, slowly, deliberately, across every face in the lane. Some old instinct, some leftover appraiser's reflex for something here is not what it's pretending to be, made my gold thread rise on its own before I even decided to look. The outline that bloomed around the stranger was not gold. It was not the banked crimson of Healer Winds either. It was a deep, restless violet, the color of a bruise about to break the skin, and the text beneath it took longer to resolve than anything I'd ever appraised before, as though the system itself were straining to translate something far above its usual register. Cultivator. Rank, withheld. Affiliation, Cloud Reach sect, outer disciple. Directive, searching for anomalous soul signature. Origin, this region, 3 days prior. Match probability against current target. Calculating. I went very still in the lane, Rue's small warm hand still wrapped around 2 of my fingers, and watched the violet-eyed stranger's gaze sweep past the blacksmith, past Aunt Bay, past Healer Wind's empty doorway up the hill, and come, unhurried, to rest directly on me. The text in front of my eyes finished resolving. Match probability, 94%. 94%. The number sat burning in the corner of my vision while every other part of me fought to look like a boy who had nothing whatsoever to hide. I had spent 30 years in my old life learning to keep my face still while telling a customer their family heirloom was worthless. A different kind of lying, but the muscles, it turned out, were the same ones. I let them work now. I made my shoulders loose. I let my hand stay exactly where it was, wrapped around 2 of Rue's small fingers, instead of doing the thing every nerve in my body screamed to do, which was to scoop her up and run. Running would have told him everything he needed to know. The stranger, gray robes, clean sword, that restless violet aura only I could see, crossed the lane toward us with the unhurried gait of a man who has never once in his life needed to hurry. Uncle Han fell into step half a pace behind him, talking fast and useless about how quiet a village this was, how nothing strange ever happened here, the kind of nervous filler people produce when they've decided a stranger is dangerous and are trying to talk their way out of having noticed. The man ignored him entirely. He stopped 3 paces from me and looked down, not unkindly, not cruelly, just with the flat, assessing patience of someone checking a box on a very long list. Xianxia, he said, by way of introduction, as though that settled something. Outer disciple, Cloudreach sect. His eyes flicked once to Rue's small hand in mine, then back to my face. You're the boy who nearly died 3 nights past. It wasn't a question, so I didn't treat it as one. I had a fever, I said. The healer up the hill saved me. So I've heard. Twice now, from 2 different households, in considerable and unprompted detail. Something in his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Villages talk. It's useful, mostly. He reached into his sleeve and drew out a small disc of pale jade, threaded on a cord, and let it hang loose from 2 fingers in the space between us. It was inert. No gold thread rose around it when I let my sight settle there, which struck me as strange until I understood a half-second later that the inertness itself was the message. Whatever this thing was built to notice, it hadn't decided to notice me yet. Hold still, he said. I held still. The jade disc swung once, twice, slowing the way a pendulum slows on its own. Beside me, Rue had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of a child who has decided, correctly, that something serious is happening and that our job right now is to not make it worse. The disc steadied. Then it began, very faintly, to glow. I felt the floor of my stomach drop out. Interesting, Xianxia said, in the tone of a man reading a tax ledger rather than a man holding someone's whole future in 2 fingers. Some response, not strong, could be residual fever chi from your illness. He tilted his head, studying me the way I used to study a coin that might be a forgery, turning it under 3 different lights before committing to a verdict. Could be something else. Is that a problem? I asked, and was almost proud of how steady it came out. That depends entirely on what something else turns out to mean. He let the disc swing back into his sleeve. There was a disturbance 3 nights ago. Not large, not the kind that gets reported to the capital or wakes a sect elder out of meditation, but large enough that someone in our outer hall felt obligated to send someone to walk the affected villages and ask a few questions. I am the someone. You happen to be the most interesting answer I've found so far. Around us, the lane had gone unnaturally still. I was aware, in the edges of my vision, of doors easing further open, of faces watching from behind half-drawn curtains, of Datu's mother pulling him back by the collar of his shirt with a sharpness that wasn't about Datu at all. I thought, with a clarity that frightened me more than the jade disc had, they are starting to wonder if I am the dangerous thing in this village. It was Healer Wen who broke the stillness, and he did it without hurrying, which I was beginning to understand was the most dangerous way a man like him could move. He came down the lane from the hill path with an empty basket on one arm, as though he'd simply been on his way to market and happened across us, though I noticed. And I don't think I was the only one. That his pace from the moment he rounded the corner was exactly fast enough to arrive before Xianxia said anything further, and not 1 beat faster than that. Disciple Jiang, he said, with a small, correct bow that managed to convey respect and absolutely no deference in the same motion. It's been some years since Cloudreach sent anyone this far from the main roads. Jiangxi's expression did something complicated. Healer Wen. The honorific landed careful, deliberate, like a man placing a foot on ice he wasn't sure would hold. I didn't realize you were still practicing out here. Where else would I practice? Wen said mildly. I'm told the mountains here have excellent yam. There was a silence that lasted 1 beat too long to be comfortable. And in that silence I watched something pass between the 2 men that had nothing to do with me at all. An old weight, a history I had no shape for yet. The kind of conversation that happens entirely in the spaces between words 2 people already know too well to need filling in. The boy, Xianxia said finally, registered a minor response on the resonance disc. Boys who nearly die of fever and then recover overnight tend to carry strange residue for a while, Wen said. I treated him myself. 18 needles, 3 sessions, standard meridian work for shock trauma. If you'd like, I can show you my notes. That won't be necessary. Xiangxi's eyes moved, once, from Wen to me and back, and I had the distinct, unpleasant sensation of being a ledger entry 2 men were quietly negotiating the value of. Though I'll note for my report that the healer who treated the anomaly vouches for him personally. You may note whatever serves your report, Wen said in a tone so pleasant it somehow made the words land like a closed door. I have nothing further to add, and the boy has herbs waiting to be sorted before the light goes. It should have ended there. For one long breath, I genuinely believed it had. Then Xianxia looked at me one final time, and something in his face shifted into a register I hadn't seen yet. Not suspicion exactly. Something closer to professional curiosity refusing to fully let go of a loose thread. A minor response is still a response, he said, mostly to himself, mostly to the report he was already composing in his head. I'll mark this village as inconclusive rather than clear. If the resonance reads again, stronger, next time, anywhere within 3 days' ride of here, Cloudreach will send someone with more authority than me to ask the same questions less politely. He inclined his head, fractionally, toward Healer Win. I trust that won't be necessary. It won't, Win said, with a confidence that I, personally, did not share at all. Xianxia mounted his horse without further ceremony and rode back out the way he'd come, and the village exhaled as one organism the moment the dust of his passing settled. Except that the exhale, when I listened closely to it, had a new and uncomfortable shape to it. I could feel it in the way Aunt Bay's eyes lingered on me, a half-second longer than they used to. In the way Datu's mother didn't quite let her son drift back toward Rue, the way she normally would have. The village hadn't decided I was dangerous. Not yet. But the question had been asked out loud, in front of everyone, by a man with a sword and a glowing jade disc, and questions like that don't fully leave a place once they've been spoken. Healer Wen didn't say anything until we were alone in his courtyard, the basket of unbought market goods still empty on his arm. Rue sent inside to help sort dried roots she had no real interest in sorting, mostly so she wouldn't hear whatever came next. You're going to ask me how I know him, he said before I'd worked up the nerve to ask anything at all. I wasn't sure I was allowed to. You're not, particularly. But you earned a small amount of honesty today by not panicking in front of a sect disciple, which is more composure than most grown men manage. He set the basket down and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before, measuring. The way I imagined he must have measured patience decades ago, before age had softened all his edges into kindness. I left Cloudreach sect a long time before you were born. Badly, if you want the short version. They don't forget badly, as a rule, which is the only reason that boy hesitated before he pushed harder on you. Will he push harder next time? He might. Or someone above him will, if your minor response decides to stop being minor. He studied me for a long moment, and I had the uncomfortable sense that whatever he said next, he had already half decided before I'd even arrived that morning. Lin Shu, whatever happened to you the night you nearly died? Whatever woke up inside you instead of letting you go? It isn't fading the way ordinary fever residue fades. I felt it twice now during your treatments. It's not weaker than it was 3 days ago. If anything, it's settled in deeper. I thought about the bar of pale light climbing toward 70% in the doorway that morning. I thought about how many more mornings I fully intended to stand in that exact doorway and let it climb further. I did not tell him that. I told myself it was because I wasn't ready and didn't examine too closely whether that was the whole truth. What does that mean? I asked instead, for Rue. It was the only question that actually mattered to me, and I think he understood that because his face softened in a way it hadn't all day. For now, nothing, he said. Cloudreach doesn't burn villages over an inconclusive reading. They have hundreds of those a year, most of which amount to nothing. Frightened animals, old graves disturbed, nothing worth a second trip. But if whatever lives in you keeps growing the way I think it's growing, inconclusive has a shelf life. And I would rather you understood that shelf life now, while there's still time to plan around it, than discover it the day someone with real rank rides into this lane, instead of an outer disciple with a jade trinket and good manners. That night, after Rue had finally surrendered to sleep with her thumb tucked against her cheek, the way she did when she was working hard not to be scared, I sat alone in the old reclining chair in the front room and let myself, for the first time all day, actually feel the size of the thing sitting on my chest. A sect existed. Sects, plural probably, each with their own version of Xianxia and his glowing disc, each capable of deciding in an afternoon that a 15-year-old boy and his 6-year-old sister were a problem worth solving with more force than words. The world I had woken into was not simply more dangerous than the one I'd left. It had a bureaucracy for finding people like me, and I had spent my very first week in it doing the one thing guaranteed to make their job easier. Using the ability that made me findable, over and over, in broad daylight, in front of a man who had once belonged to the exact organization, now hunting it. The conflict outside my door had cooled. Xianxia was gone, riding back the way he'd come, his report half written in his head with a question mark where a period should have been. The village's nervous glances would soften again in a week or two, the way village suspicions usually did, once nothing further happened to feed them. but nothing about the actual problem had ended. It had simply gone quiet the way a held breath goes quiet. Not resolved, only paused, waiting on whatever I did next to decide whether it needed to be let out again. I closed my eyes, more out of habit than intention, and let my exhausted mind drift towards sleep. It was in that half second before sleep took me, the strange, undefended space where the mind stops performing for anyone, even itself, that the gold thread of my sight rose on its own for the first time, unbidden, with no object in front of me to settle on at all. It settled on me instead. A single line of text assembled itself in the dark behind my closed eyes, plain and flat, and utterly without the comfort of explanation. Status, resonance rising, detection threshold lowering. I opened my eyes again very fast, and the dark front room held nothing but shadow and the banked coals of the cooking fire. The words were gone. But I lay awake a long time after that, listening to Rue's slow breathing through the thin wall, doing arithmetic I didn't want to do on exactly how many days a falling threshold gave us before the next visitor who came down that lane wore robes a great deal less patient than Xianxia's.
Did you enjoy the video? Drop a like to let me know and smash the subscribe button if you want to see more. I love to hear your thoughts. Tell me your favorite moment, what you didn't like, or what I can do better next time in the comment below. Thanks for watching. Bye bye. See you in the next one.